news this morning that, quite honestly, I'm a little confused by, and I was hoping you could navigate it and help us understand, which is that Israel bombed Qatar, which houses a lot of Hamas officials. What happened here? And if I were to introduce just the skeptical question, will this potentially endanger America's own interests in the Middle East? So please, Ben, help me better understand the situation.
Sure. So I think that the lead up to understand here is that Qatar sort of plays both sides when it comes to its negotiating stance between Hamas and Israel and the United States. So it has provided extraordinary material support to Hamas directly, billions of dollars in material support to Hamas. The leadership of Hamas have been living in Qatar for years at five-star hotels. Hamas's priorities have been pressed by Qatar in negotiations multiple times. Qatar has not put significant pressure on Hamas in the past to release the hostages or to end the war. And so basically, as Israel nears the end of the war, which is what this last movement in Gaza City is supposed to be, there was a final offer that was put on the table actually by the Trump administration that essentially said that Hamas should release the remaining 48 hostages, meaning 28 dead bodies and 20 alive hostages. And the United States would then guarantee, through its own honest brokerage, some sort of end to the war that would result in the disarming of Hamas and the movement of the Gaza Strip to presumably some sort of coalitional government supported by regional states and the rebuilding of the area. And Qatar was pushing Hamas, apparently, we heard. And Hamas this morning in Arabic actually rejected it. That's not been widely reported by the media, but it's true. Hamas actually rejected the American offer. The president had put out via Truth Social a statement saying, this is your last chance, and if you don't do that, bad things are going to happen. The idea that Israel would be able to fly 10 F-16s all the way across the Middle East to Qatar to strike a very specific terror target in Doha without American knowledge beggars the imagination. It is extraordinarily unlikely, to say the very least. Honestly, it would not be wildly improbable if Qatar knew that was coming as well. And so Israel struck at the top level of the remaining Hamas in Qatar in an attempt to basically change the negotiating status. So the basic idea here is if you will not negotiate, if you refuse to get to the end of this war, well, then maybe we'll find somebody who can. Or maybe the idea is that you're safe nowhere until this war ends. Additional pressure had to be brought to bear, and that's why Israel did what it did. Obviously, I, as well, am on Team Civilization. I'm very happy to see Hamas's top leaders killed. I hope that as many of them in the leadership, with as little loss of civilian life as possible, I hope that as many of them died in this attack as humanly possible. And again, I'd be very surprised. I mean, we do know actually from contemporaneous reporting that the United States was at least given the heads up on the Israeli operation in the moments before it went.
I just spent time in Japan, and one of the things that kind of looms over Japan is that Japan, they engaged in an unconditional surrender. That they said, we're done. And they laid down their arms, obviously, after the 2 atomic bombs. Very controversial. People have mixed opinions on it. I certainly do. But that it is unconditional surrender. Is that what Israel is aiming for here? I suppose that is a question that I get a lot on campus. What does success look like? Because I think we could all agree a long war is not good for Israel. A long, drawn-out war. And we're coming towards 2 years in about a month. So it's been about 23 months. So what does ultimate success look like in the Gaza Strip?
Now, my main critique of the Netanyahu administration in Israel and the Netanyahu government is they didn't move faster. I think this should have been a much more accelerated process. Israel set out at the beginning of this war with 2 goals, as articulated by the Israeli government. Goal number 1 was to get as many hostages out as humanly possible, to free the hostages. And second was to win the war. In many ways, those are mutually exclusive goals, because if you actually wish to win the war, then you have to do things militarily that are going to involve actual movement on the ground. And meanwhile, Hamas is attempting to basically use the hostages as its own form of human shields. They've used their own civilians as human shields. They're also using the hostages as a form of human shield. And so as you came to the end of the war, this was always going to be the question, is how the war kind of came to its final terminus. The priorities that Netanyahu has laid out publicly include essentially, basically, it's let the hostages out, and there can't be a future military threat to Israel. Those are, if you had to sum it all up, those are the 2 things. How that materializes, in my opinion, is likely to be an Israeli military occupation of large swaths of the Gaza Strip, the setting up of humanitarian areas, particularly on the coast and in Rafah, in which humanitarian aid is provided, a pathway out for people who actually want to leave. This is the only conflict of which I'm aware on planet Earth in which there are outside countries telling people who would like to leave that they literally cannot. The Trump administration has been trying to facilitate the ability of people who want to leave to do so, and has also been trying to facilitate the entry of not only humanitarian aid, but investment into the areas that have been cleared of terrorists. And then you can see some sort of Hamas-free rebuilding. That would be the goal of the end of the war. Now, my understanding is that the sort of last untouched area of the Gaza Strip in terms of Israeli serious military operations is Gaza City. It's why there's been so much focus on Gaza City. Last I heard, Israel already controls something 40 to 50% of the territory in Gaza City. They've been warning people to get out for at least a couple of weeks now. Hamas has been stopping people at checkpoints and turning them back and shooting them if they don't stay in the city to be used as human shields by Hamas. So that's the current situation on the ground.
What other feedback or criticism would you have about this situation? I know that it's impossible for anyone to listen to everything that you ever say, but looking at this from an American perspective, what else would you say things could have been handled differently? Maybe on the PR front, maybe also just on a conduct front. Where would you say, as an outsider, things that could have been handled better, more efficiently, or with more precision?
So number one, there's no such thing as a perfect war. So obviously in any war, there are going to be things that happen that are ugly and that are terrible. And that is why war is a terrible thing. As far as a sort of operational front, again, I've spent an awful lot of time in Israel. I've watched tape of operations happening, drone operations. I've met with an enormous number of Israeli soldiers, young men and women, people who are 18, 19, 20 years old, who have had legitimately their limbs blown off going house to house in an area where they didn't have to. The charge that Israel has been indiscriminate in its use of force in the Gaza Strip is an absurdity on its face. Israel has complete air superiority over the Gaza Strip. If it wanted to level the place and turn it into a parking lot October 8th, it certainly had the military capacity to do so. It has not done that. Instead, it has sacrificed legitimately 1,000 of its own young men, particularly in these areas, and thousands more who are wounded for the rest of their lives, going house to house in an attempt to prevent all that, and is currently shipping in 4,400 calories per day per person into the Gaza Strip, much of which is then stolen by Hamas. So that is not to say that any war is perfect. This war has been conducted in about as meticulous way as any urban war in history. Just because war is ugly doesn't mean that it's being fought wrongly. And I think that the main mistake that Israel has made is misunderstanding how public relations works, in the sense that they couldn't have presented this war in a better, kinder way that people would have loved. What they could have done is move faster. And the reality is that the American way of doing war is to win as fast as possible. And we don't like long, drawn-out occupations. We don't like long, drawn-out military operations. That's true in Iraq. It's true in Afghanistan. It's true in Ukraine. It's true in the Gaza Strip. And so the kind of things that we Americans like to see are, for example, the operations against Hezbollah that took about 3 weeks to 5 weeks, or the operation against Iran, which took about 12 days, right? Those are operations that any ally of the United States can sustain. Long operations like the one that Israel has been performing in the Gaza Strip are inherently very, very difficult from PR level. And I'm not sure, to be frank, that there is a way for Israel to, quote unquote, win the PR war in the middle of a very long war against an intransigent terrorist enemy that legitimately embeds itself in the most damaging places.
A claim I receive often, and we're starting our campus tour tomorrow, is that Israel is committing genocide. How do you respond to that, Ben?
There is literally no definition of genocide by which Israel is committing a genocide. Typically, a genocide involves the targeted killing of the vast majority of the population, or at least an attempt to do so. There has never been a genocide attempted in world history in which the food that was being shipped in was more than the daily caloric intake of the average American into the areas where you're supposedly attempting to genocide the population. The total population loss in the Gaza Strip thus far has been 3%. During the Holocaust, just to take a reference, it was 50%. During Rwanda, it was significantly higher than 3%. You don't issue leaflet warnings to people. You don't go house to house in a genocide in an attempt to reduce civilian casualties. I understand that people use genocide at this point to just mean thing I don't like. And I get that. I understand. Nobody likes war. Nobody wants war. Certainly not the Israelis, who are not at war on October 6th. The fact is that every Israeli family has to send their 18-year-old son or daughter off to the military with the possibility that they're going to get blown up in Gaza. That is not something that any Israeli wants, right, left, or center. The real question is whether the accusations are accurate. They certainly are not, again, by any stretch of the imagination.
Ben Shapiro, author of Lions and Scavengers. We're going to get to that in a second. I have one or two other questions on Israel. I think it's very important for our audience to hear this, though, because there is an incessant campaign. And one thing a friend said to me, interestingly, which is, okay, Charlie, we've pushed back against the media on COVID, on lockdowns, on Ukraine, on the border, so like maybe we should also ask a question. Is the media totally presenting the truth when it comes to Israel? Just a question, that maybe we shouldn't believe everything the media says, because I know I've been conditioned to ask a lot more critical questions over the last couple of years. So, Ben, some people would accuse Israel of wanting to ethnically cleanse. Some people in the Israeli government are saying, again, it's all over the place, right? You have opinions all over. In your opinion, what would a good outcome 5 years from now be, and how does one respond to the claims of ethnic cleansing?
So ethnic cleansing, the idea, presumably, that population movement is equivalent to ethnic cleansing. I think ethnic cleansing is a term that's been fairly recently coined to describe population movement during war. And the reality is that's been ongoing for literally all of human history. The idea that Israel is, quote unquote, forcing people out of the Gaza Strip, that is not the stated policy of the Israeli government. The idea is if people want to leave, they can, but they're not being forced to leave. Again, moving people out of heavily urbanized areas that are honeycombed with terrorist booby traps pretty much everywhere is not the same thing as, quote unquote, ethnic cleansing. And I think that ethnic cleansing is very often used as sort of a softer form of the genocide attack, the idea being that Israel is trying to kill everyone, which, of course, is not true. As far as your earlier question about what we believe from the media, one of the things that I find kind of astonishing in some of the folks on the right who are highly critical of Israel is actually the lack of the lack of skepticism when it comes to legacy media. Legacy media are radically anti-Israel overall. The New York Times can certainly not be accused of being a pro-Israel outlet. It'd be very difficult to make the accusation that the Associated Press, which has worked hand in glove with Hamas for years, or Reuters, that these are wildly pro-Israel outlets. And yet, when it comes to the reporting, it seems to be sort of the opposite.
Ben,
so the
Ben,
perception the legacy media is like owned by the Jews. And
I was going to say, Ben, come on.
Israel.
You Jews own the media, Ben. So, I mean, come on. As you could tell by all the wonderful headlines you guys get.
Well, I mean, dude, the accusation that we own the media has not prevented, the Daily Wire from employing people who radically disagree with me on all of these matters. I mean, I don't agree with Matt Walsh on foreign policy. Matt obviously is a major host over at Daily Wire, and that's just my shop. And I'm overtly pro-Israel. Right? I mean, I'm not making any bones about this. I'm a Jew and I'm a Zionist. I'm not going to pretend that to say otherwise would be absolutely silly. To suggest that some sort of atheistic Jewish person by birth who does not care about Judaism or Israel owning the New York Times means the New York Times is pro-Israel is to ignore literally every bit of coverage they have ever done for my entire lifetime.
We're running out of time here, but just last question on this, Ben. I know this might be a tougher question, but Bibi said, quote, I didn't like how he said this, I'll be honest. You can't be MAGA if you're anti-Israel. I don't like it for a couple reasons. How did you analyze that statement from Bibi?
I mean, and I think that there is the ungenerous way of interpreting that and then the generous way of interpreting that. So the ungenerous way is to suggest that you have to hold a particular position on every Israeli governmental activity in order to be MAGA, which, of course, is not true. I mean, you can disagree from the right or from the left with Bibi's policies, and you can still be plenty MAGA. I think the idea that Bibi is putting out there is that if you are taking Hamas's side against Israel in a conflict, it is very difficult to align that with the stated positions of the Trump administration or what President Trump himself is doing right now. I certainly is true.
You cannot look. I think you can have disagreements on Israel and still be MAGA. Obviously, you should be America first. But if you're pro-Hamas, you're something darker, and we shouldn't put up with that. Ben, tell us about your important new book.
So the basic idea in Lions and Scavengers is that inside every human heart, and this goes back to the book of Genesis, that there really is the dutiful part of you that wants to engage in what God made for you, this incredible rationalistic world in which you can mostly understand what's going on, and you have a duty to do the moral thing. You get up every morning, you try to build something, you try to be innovative and risk-taking, you try to defend your civilization, you try to build the social fabric. And then there is the part of us that's driven by envy. And that part of us just looks at our problems and immediately attributes it to some shadowy force outside of our control and tries to rip down the very systems that actually provide prosperity, tries to rip down the lions out of pure envy. Here, think Zoran Mamdani. And that exists in all of us, but it exists civilizationally as well. And when you look at the sort of activities that were taking place on college campus last year, and you see the weird agglomeration of causes that all come together under varying banners. Sometimes it's hating President Trump over immigration. Sometimes it's on Israel. Sometimes it's on LGBT. But it's the same exact people all marching together. And you wonder to yourself, what do these people have in common? And the answer is pretty much nothing, except they really, really don't like our civilization and see the fundamental basis of our civilization as evil and wrong and believe that it needs to be torn out by the root. This is, to take the most obvious example, Queers for Palestine. Everybody's been puzzling over what the hell is that, right? Queers in Palestine get thrown off buildings. So what is it? The answer is that the radical LGBTQ group doesn't have much in common with the pro-Hamas group, except that both really, really hate the West and believe that the traditional values of our civilization need to be destroyed in order so that they can live more fulfilling lives in some way.
What would you say is the missing component for those of us in the West to stand up against these forces? What would you say we're doing well and that we need to do more of?
I mean, I think that what we lack, and I think we're starting to see a restoration of it, is the courage to actually stand up on our hind legs and say no. I think that good people tend to be introspective. We tend to think, okay, what did I do wrong? How do I fix that? We tend to apologize when we do something wrong. Bad people tend to take an apology and then grind your face into the dust over it because they're not engaged in guilt cultures. They're engaged in what are called shame cultures, where the most important thing is not to be made to feel shame, and it is to shame others. And so I think that we, those of us who consider ourselves part of Western civilization, we need to recognize that a constant self-abnegation, a constant attempt to tear ourselves down out of a misguided sense of humility in the face of people who are happy to just destroy our civilization from without and within, that is a gigantic mistake. And it is totally fine to say to people who wish to destroy our civilization, no, your values suck and they don't belong here.
Where does all this resentment come from?
It comes from a wide variety of places, but it tends to come in general from a feeling of frustration and enervation. And so I think that you can get that from people who believe they have been marginalized. You can get that from people who believe they deserve more. You see it a lot, actually, with university students who seem to believe that they deserve a $250,000 salary for a gender studies degree because they've been taught that they ought to be getting more, and then they don't get it. And then they're angry at their parents for not having put them in a position to do that, and so they rebel against everything that they've been taught and everything they haven't been taught. I also think it comes from a bored population. Very often you have people who grew up without any sense of external threat, and they think that pretty much everything that's good in life is the baseline, that's just normal, and that you can tear away everything without the baseline falling away. That, of course, is just false. So some of it comes from ignorance. Some of it comes from envy. The reality is that gratitude as a characteristic of human beings has to be cultivated. It's something you have to teach your kids, gratitude. Envy is totally natural. Right? Envy is easy to do. You see it with small children, right? I have 4, and it's very easy to see kids envy each other and get on each other's case. Being grateful for what they have is a very difficult thing. You have to teach your kids to say thank you. You don't have to teach your kids to say no.
Ben, thank you for your time, and thanks for going through all the questions on the very important topics today. Lions and Scavengers is the book. Thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks.